So, in my video talking about spiritual amnesia and two collective consciousnesses, I mentioned that I was going to make a video to give people a chance to investigate for themselves the validity of materialism. So, that's what this video is. About 10 to 15 minutes into his talk, he walks you through an exercise you can do on your own to see that matter that exists independent of consciousness is indeed an illusion. But I think a big part of growing is realizing that we're in a spiritual war. That's what this whole life is. But most people are blind to that and just think that, they have this crappy job or crappy relationship and they've never really felt like they fit in. They think if I just try hard enough, if I just look long enough, then eventually I can find something within the materialism paradigm that makes me feel happy and fulfilled. And you may find happiness and fulfillment for a while, but if it's built around materialism, then it won't last long. It just won't. You could live 1,000 years believing in materialism and you never find lasting fulfillment. There's a reason why the apparent world is in the state that it's in right now. The materialism paradigm that we've all been brainwashed into believing since we were kids, so much so that we don't even question it. We just think it's common sense that materialism is real and that everything is divided up. And, if you're truly satisfied with the state of everything, then continue on without questioning the materialism paradigm. But if not, then start exploring the idea that maybe this quote unquote world isn't what you think it is. So, this personal investigation exercise is led by an individual who's been against the materialism paradigm for a long time. And I just want to quickly address those people who in my other videos have said that he sounds like some kind of cult leader. They know nothing about him, but based on his voice alone and the fact that he has a different perspective on things, they say that. And yes, he talks calmly. There's a sense of peace that comes with not worshiping materialism. I would argue that the majority of the world is in the cult of materialism, but most people they're not consciously aware of that. And yes, he does have a British accent. If people can look beyond that and not be judgmental, then hopefully we can open our mind to new ideas.
A time is coming when a single carrot, freshly perceived, will trigger a revolution. So, what is the nature of perception? Somebody asked the painter Paul Cézanne that question. And he replied, "A time is coming when a single carrot, freshly observed, will trigger a revolution." He said that over 100 years ago. So I would suggest that that time has come. And he said this in response to our conventional way of perceiving. Perception, and indeed all experience, is conventionally believed to be divided into two essential ingredients: a subject, a self on the inside, and an object, other, or world on the outside. And this belief that perception, and in fact all experience, is divided into these two essential ingredients underpins our entire world culture. It underpins the way we think, feel, act, perceive, and relate. Enshrined in this belief is the idea that there is an outside world made of something called matter, and an inside self made of something called consciousness or awareness, which shares the limits of and is itself a product of the body. A world made of matter on the outside, a self made out of a limited temporary consciousness on the inside, and these two entities joined together by something called mind. And this fundamental presumption upon which our world culture is based is enshrined in our language, in such phrases as, I see the tree. I, the inside self, connected to the outside object, other, or world, by an act of perceiving. Now, in order to restore some credibility to the English language, I would like to also quote what William Blake said 100 years before Cézanne, when he was asked exactly the same question about the nature of perception. He said, when the doors of perception are cleansed, everything will appear to man as it really is. When the doors of perception are cleansed or divested of this belief that experience is divided into these two essential ingredients, an inside self and an outside object, other, or world. Everything, all things, ordinary things, like Cézanne's carrot, or this experience that we're having right now, will be perceived as it really is. Not a collection of finite objects known by a finite self, but as it truly is. So, in order to explore the true nature of perception, in fact, the true nature of experience, thousands and thousands of artists and scientists with them embarked on a path of exploration. The two paths of knowledge and love or devotion are very well described in the Indian and indeed the Western tradition. The two paths of Jnana Yoga and Bhakti Yoga, the way of knowledge and the way of love, were part of mainstream India. But this third path, the way of perception, the way of form, was not so widespread in India. It was found in the tantric schools of India, Tibet and Kashmir. And it was also found in the laboratories and studios of scientists and artists in the West. This yoga of perception, this way of perception is the third way that is not usually spoken of. the two paths of jnana and bhakti we are all familiar with. But there is a third yoga, Rupa Yoga, the way of beauty, the way of form. So how did these artists and scientists explore the nature of perception, the dualistic presumption that is enshrined in our language in phrases such as I see the tree? We can go in either direction to explore the true nature of our experience, either inwards towards the I, which is the way of the mystic, or outwards towards the tree, the carrot, the object, the world, which is the way of the artist or the scientist. People like Cézanne and Blake and innumerable artists and scientists went apparently outwards, seeming to go in the opposite direction from the mystic that went inwards. In fact, it turns out that if both disciplines, the discipline of the mystic and the discipline of the artist or scientist, is taken far enough, they both arrive at the same conclusion. So Paul Cézanne stood in front of one of the most solid, enduring structures of nature, a mountain, Mont Saint-Victoire. And he had this realization: I don't know or experience a mountain. All I know is my perception of the mountain. Exactly the same could be said of us now. Look around you now. We think we see a room, or a world. In fact, we have no idea that we are experiencing a room or a world. All we are knowing or experiencing is our perception of the room or world. In fact, we can't even be sure of that. We are experiencing perception, but we can't be sure that it's a perception of a room or a world, because we never come in contact with that room or world. It's not a perception of a world, it is just a perception. Experience knows perception. Thought adds of the world. Keep looking around you at the same room, the same, knowing only your current perception, and ask yourself, is there anything present in the perception other than perceiving? Is there anything present in the sight of the so-called room other than the experience of seeing? Look around you and try to find anything other than the experience of seeing. And having ascertained in your experience that all we know of a so-called world or room is the experience of seeing, go further. Ask yourself, what is the substance, the nature, the reality of seeing. Seeing must be made of something. And if we are experiencing seeing, we must be experiencing what it is made of. Go intimately now to the experience of seeing, and with an imaginary hand, reach out and touch the stuff that seeing is made of. What do you find there? Do you find anything other than the knowing of your experience? And go back to the experience of seeing and ask yourself, is there any substance present there other than the knowing of it? And don't limit this experiment just to seeing. Range freely over your entire experience. Thoughts, images, sensations, perceptions. Do you ever know or come in contact with anything other than the knowing of your experience? Try now to find something in your experience other than the knowing of it. It's not possible. All we find in experience is knowing. Not the knowing of experience. Just as previously we discovered, it's not a perception of the world. All that is known in experience is knowing, consciousness. Now ask yourself, what is it that knows this knowing? It is obviously known. Experience is known. What is it that knows knowing? Is it known by something other than itself? No. It is knowing that knows itself. This knowing that is the reality of all experience knows itself. It never comes in contact with anything other than itself. Pure consciousness is only ever aware of itself. It never knows or comes in contact with an object or an other. Now, if we ask this knowing, or pure consciousness, what do you know about yourself? If we ask awareness, which is identical to consciousness, if we ask awareness, what is your experience of yourself? Do you ever experience the absence of yourself? If it could speak, it would say no. Do you ever find a limit in yourself? If it could speak, it would say no. In other words, if we ask pure knowing or awareness what its experience of itself is, it will always reply, if it could speak, in my own experience of myself, I am ever present and unlimited. That is, I am eternal and infinite. It is only thought that superimposes the apparent limits and destiny of the body onto awareness, thereby seeming to reduce awareness or consciousness into a finite, located, temporary self. But if we stick closely with awareness's experience of itself, and after all, awareness is the only one that is aware of itself, and therefore awareness is the only one that can legitimately know anything for sure about itself. If we stick to awareness's experience of itself, it will always say, all I ever come in contact with or know is my own eternal, infinite self. When I say awareness, I'm not referring to some abstract, extraordinary, cosmic awareness. I'm talking about the very knowing with which each of us is knowing their current experience right now. The knowing with which you are knowing this ordinary experience is God's infinite, eternal awareness. And although from the point of view of the mind, it seems to know a collection of finite objects and selves, from its own point of view, which is the only real point of view, it never knows or comes in contact with a finite object or self. It only ever knows its own eternal, infinite being. And whether we realize it or not, that is the experience we are having right now. So if it is true that pure consciousness or awareness is the only one that is aware, and all this awareness is ever aware of is its own infinite, eternal being, how does it come about that we seem to experience a world of finite objects and selves? So to answer this question, I have to go to my favorite metaphor of the screen and the image. Only the screen we are talking about here is a magical screen. You have to imagine a TV screen. For a start, the screen has no edges. It is a screen that is infinitely expanded. But it is a screen that is also aware. So when the movie begins on our magical TV screen, it is viewed not by somebody sitting on a sofa, but it is viewed by the screen on which it is appearing. So this screen is a metaphor for the light of pure knowing, infinite awareness. And before the movie begins, the screen, our aware screen, is just aware of its own transparent emptiness. Just as before any appearance of thought, feeling, sensation, or perception, awareness just knows and is itself alone. Now, when the movie begins, a scene appears, such as a street scene, houses, cars, people. What does the screen experience? Does the appearance of the street scene suddenly fragment the screen into a multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves? No. From the screen's point of view, and the screen is the only one that is doing the viewing, it simply continues to experience its own ever-present, infinite self. And the appearance of the street is just a coloring of itself, a modulation of itself, a vibration of its self. But it never ceases to be or to know its own eternal, infinite self. So for whom are there a multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves? For one of the characters in the movie. Instead of asking the screen, what is your experience? If we ask one of the characters in the movie, one of the people walking down the street in the movie, what is your experience? From the point of view, from the limited point of view of that character, the character will look around and will say, I see objects and selves, and I am one of those objects. So from the limited and illusory point of view of one of the characters in the movie, there are a multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves. But from the real and only point of view of the screen, there is no such multiplicity and diversity. There are no objects and no selves. There is just its own ever-present, infinite being. It never ceases to be or to know itself. In other words, a multiplicity and diversity of finite objects are only real as objects and selves from the illusory point of view of one of those finite selves. In other words, the separate self, who is represented in this metaphor by the character in the movie. The separate self is only a real separate self from its own illusory point of view. Ignorance is only real from the illusory point of view of ignorance. Awareness knows nothing of a separate self. It knows nothing of a separate inside self, nor does it know anything of a separate outside world. The inside self and the outside world are superimposed by thought onto the reality of our experience, which means this very experience that we are having now is itself infinite awareness, staring itself in the face. Now imagine in the movie that a child is born. If we ask one of the characters in the movie what has happened, the character will say, a new person has appeared, a new being has been born. And then, as the movie proceeds, that character will grow up, eventually get sick, grow old, and die. At least that's what the character in the movie will tell us. But what if we ask the screen, what is your experience? When the child is born, what is your experience? We're talking to the screen now. We're talking to infinite awareness. And the screen will answer, nothing new comes into existence. Nothing is added to myself. Nothing grows old. No one grows sick. And nobody dies. Because from the point of view of this infinite screen, from the point of view of the light of pure knowing, it only ever knows or comes in contact with itself. And itself is the ever-present reality or substance of all experience. This is what Parmenides meant when he said, that which is never ceases to be. That which is not never comes into existence. That which is luminous, empty knowing. Never ceases to be in its own experience of itself. It wasn't born, it's not growing old, it never knows sickness or death. That which is never ceases to be, and that which is not, for instance, a finite object or self, that which is not never comes into existence. The word existence comes from two Latin words, ex and sistere, meaning to stand out from. Nothing truly stands out from infinite awareness. That which is never ceases to be. That which is not never comes into existence. No finite object ever truly comes into existence. No finite object and no finite self. Whether we realize it or not, this very experience, I'm not speaking of extraordinary mystical experiences that 1 in a million enlightened sages have. I'm talking about the reality of our ordinary, everyday experience. This very experience that we are having now is only infinite awareness shining. Knowing and being only itself, never being or becoming an object, other, self, or world. This is the revolution that Cézanne was talking about. A time is coming when a single object, freshly perceived, will trigger a revolution. The revolution he was speaking of was this understanding that matter, mind, and consciousness are not three separate realities. They are not three separate things. They are three ways of seeing. three ways of seeing one reality. If we stand as a body, if we believe and feel that what we essentially are is something made out of matter called a body, our experience will appear in accordance with that belief. Our experience will seem to be a multiplicity and diversity of separate objects. That appearance is just the inevitable corollary, the inevitable counterpart to the belief that what I am is an object, a body. Conversely, if we think that what we are is essentially mind, then experience will appear in accordance with that belief. Everything will be, we will cease being realists and we will become idealists. Everything will seem to be mind. Thinking, feeling, sensing, seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling. And if we know ourselves to be ever-present, unlimited awareness, then it is inevitable that experience will appear to us in accordance with that understanding. We will no longer think or feel on behalf of an inside self, and no longer experience a multiplicity and diversity of separate, fragmented objects and selves. Everything will be seen as it truly is, as William Blake said. When the doors of perception are cleansed, everything will appear to man as it truly is.